The wind carried no mercy on the frontier. A young widow, dirt caked to her torn dress, clutched her newborn against her chest while men spat at her feet and cast her aside. Her husband was gone, the land stripped from her hands, and the desert sun beat down like judgment itself. But legends say the story of justice always begins with despair. The sky stretched wide and merciless, a pale vault over endless plains that shimmered with heat. Dust rolled across the main street of Ash Hollow, a town built of weathered boards and hollow promises. Where law was spoken only by the strong and silence was the weak man's prayer. Horses snorted at their posts, tails lashing against flies, while rough-handed men leaned from saloon porches and storefronts, eyes narrowing at the woman staggering down the road with nothing but a swaddled child pressed tight against her heart. Clara Whitfield had once crossed this street at her husband's side. Thomas's stride had been proud, his handshake firm, his dreams stitched into every acre of their ranch beyond the river. Now his name was spoken with mockery, as if his sudden death beneath a crushed wagon wheel were the fault of his own careless hands. But Clara knew the truth. Men with greed in their bellies and violence in their eyes had taken him, because land was worth more than life in this place. And a widow, they figured, was worth less than nothing. Her boots scuffed in the dust, too worn to hold their shape. The baby squirmed against her chest, whimpering at the sun's glare, and she pulled him tighter, rocking him though her own arms trembled with exhaustion. From the doorway of the mercantile, a man spat into the street and muttered, "Should have gone back east where she belongs." Another laughed, his voice cracking through the air like a whip. "Ain't no place here for orphans and widows." Their words landed harder than stones. Clara lifted her chin, though her cheeks burned with humiliation. The sheriff, a man swollen by whiskey and cowardice, had been the one to order her off the ranch. Papers signed, deed transferred, all done neat and legal under the gang's watchful eyes. "Nothing more I can do," he'd said, not meeting her gaze. She'd pleaded, her voice breaking, but his silence told her the truth. The law had already been sold. Now the homestead where she and Thomas had planted their first crops, where laughter had once lived in the walls, was gone. Even the rocking chair by the hearth would belong to other hands before nightfall. She staggered to the well in the center of town, lowering the bucket with shaking arms, her throat raw from thirst. The rope scraped against her blistered palms, and when she bent to lift the dipper, a boot knocked it from her grasp. Water spilled into the dust, vanishing as quickly as hope. The man above her sneered, his grin rotting with tobacco. "Don't reckon you'll be needing much water where you're headed." His friends cackled, the sound coarse and merciless. Clara stared at the wet stain in the dirt, her lips cracked and bleeding, and swallowed the cry rising in her chest. The baby's soft whimper was the only sound she allowed herself. She moved on, past faces turned away, past doors closed tight. No hand reached for her, no whisper offered comfort. Even the women who had once exchanged bread recipes with her now clutched their skirts and looked away, unwilling to risk the wrath of the men who ruled with pistol and fear. Loneliness settled on her shoulders heavier than the child she carried, pressing her down until her knees threatened to buckle. Still she kept walking because to stop was to admit defeat, and she had promised Thomas, promised herself, that she would not let their son grow up without knowing strength. The afternoon sun bled into evening, painting the desert in cruel shades of gold and crimson. Clara reached the edge of town, where the road split between open plains and the canyon trail. Her body quaked with weariness. She sank onto the hard earth, cradling the infant close, and whispered words meant to soothe, though her own heart was breaking. "Hush now, little one. Mama's here. Mama won't let them take you too." Tears slid down her cheeks, streaking the dirt, falling onto the child's dark lashes. In that moment, she felt smaller than the dust itself, swallowed by a land that gave nothing and demanded everything. From the shadows of the livery stable, a pair of eyes watched her. The man leaned against a post, weathered hat pulled low, his frame tall and unbent despite the years carved into his face. He had seen widows before, seen men broken and land stolen, seen justice bent until it snapped. He did not step forward, not yet. The town would not forgive kindness shown too quickly. But he watched the way Clara rocked her child, the fire hidden beneath her despair, and something old stirred in him, something he had long buried with the ghosts of war and blood. The night wind rose, carrying the scent of dust and wood smoke, rattling loose shutters on forgotten buildings. Clara closed her eyes, her body curling protectively around her child, as though the world might vanish if she just held on tight enough. The stranger did not move, did not speak, but the line of his jaw hardened. He knew the shape of this story. He had lived it in one form or another, and though he kept to the shadows, unseen and silent, a decision had already begun to take root in him. For while the frontier offered no mercy, it also birthed legends. And sometimes, in the lowest dust where hope was meant to die, a seed of justice waited to rise. Elias Boone lived in the silence beyond the town's edge, where the cottonwoods bent in the wind and the prairie stretched unbroken to the horizon. His house was a squat cabin of rough-hewn timber, its roof sagging under the years, the fields around it more dust than grass. To the townsfolk of Ash Hollow, Elias was a relic, a man who had once tried to carve a living from the land but failed. Children whispered about his scars, the deep lines that crossed his cheek and jaw, and the limp in his step. Some called him a drunk, others a madman, but none bothered to learn more. He kept to himself, and in a place where survival demanded endless toil, few cared for the lives of men who chose solitude. Yet Elias had not always been a shadow. Once, long ago, his voice had commanded men in battlefields where smoke blackened the sky and rivers ran red. He had been a captain in the Union ranks, a tactician whose calm under fire earned him respect and the loyalty of desperate soldiers. He had carried men off fields of carnage, buried comrades with his own hands, and seen too many boys die with their eyes wide open. When the war ended, he had returned west to start anew, trading rifle and saber for plow and saddle. But the soil of the frontier was not kind, and neither were the men who prowled its edges. By the time whispers began of his failure as a cattleman, Elias had let the rumors take root. It was easier than telling the truth, that his battles had never really ended, that every night the ghosts pressed in, demanding silence, demanding solitude. Clara Whitfield, meanwhile, was learning the cruelty of hunger. The scraps she gathered from behind the saloon or the stale bread a timid woman slipped her when no one watched were barely enough to keep herself alive, let alone a newborn. The baby's cries grew weaker, less insistent, as the days passed, and she felt her heart clench with fear each time his tiny chest rose and fell as if it might stop at any moment. She tried to sing the lullabies Thomas once hummed on the porch, but her voice cracked, brittle as the dry grass that rustled in the wind. Nights were the hardest, when cold pressed into her bones and loneliness weighed heavier than any hunger. The town had grown meaner since the outlaws took root. They lounged outside the saloon, pistols swinging at their hips, their boots stretched across the porch rails. Their laughter rolled like thunder whenever a man flinched or a shopkeeper offered discounts in hopes of avoiding trouble. The sheriff, red-faced and sweating, made a show of patrolling the street, but everyone knew where his loyalties lay. A bottle on his desk and a purse of gold in his pocket kept him quiet, and the outlaws thrived. They claimed cattle, seized land, and tightened their grip until the town breathed only when they allowed it. Clara had no illusions. Without help, she and her child would vanish like dust on the wind. But she had no one to turn to, until one night when the hunger drove her to the edge of collapse. She had tried to nurse her child, but her body had nothing left to give. His cries pierced her heart, shrill and desperate, and she pressed him close, whispering apologies, praying for a miracle. That was when she heard the creak of a barn door nearby, the scrape of boots on gravel, and a low voice cutting through the night air. "You'll not last another day in this wind," the man said. She turned, startled, and saw him. A tall figure with broad shoulders, his hat shadowing his face, the lantern in his hand casting faint light on weathered features. She recognized him immediately. Elias Boone, the recluse, the scarred loner. She had heard the whispers, had seen him pass in town now and then, silent as stone. Fear rose in her throat, but there was no menace in his voice. Only certainty. He motioned her toward his barn. Inside, the smell of hay and animals wrapped around her, softer than the cold night air. He set down a sack, pulling from it bread, smoked meat, and a flask of water. "Eat," he said simply. Clara hesitated, pride warring with desperation. But the baby whimpered again, and that decided her. She ate until her hands trembled, until tears stung her eyes, and the child finally slept, his tiny lips moving against her chest as though comfort had returned at last. Elias said little. He watched her quietly, his face unreadable, as though measuring the weight of her suffering. When she tried to thank him, he only shook his head. "No thanks," he muttered. "Just rest." He spread a blanket in the loft, and though it was rough, it was the warmest place she had known since Thomas's death. That night, for the first time in weeks, Clara slept without waking to the gnaw of fear in her stomach. Days passed, and Elias's shadow lingered near her. He did not parade his kindness through town. Instead, he left bundles of firewood by the barn, set aside flour and beans when he had little enough himself, and mended a corner of the roof so rain would not seep in. Clara noticed the way he moved, efficient and steady, as if each task were a battle drill he had long mastered. He asked nothing of her, though sometimes she caught him watching the child with a strange softness, as though memories stirred in him too deeply to speak aloud. The town, however, noticed. Whispers curled like smoke from one end of the street to the other. The widow Whitfield, they said, had found company in Boone's shadow. Some sneered, others scoffed, but suspicion grew sharper. The outlaws mocked him openly, calling him the old hound taking in strays. Elias never answered. He carried his silence like armor, his eyes narrowing only slightly when their laughter rang too close. Clara feared what might come of it, but she also felt, for the first time since Thomas's death, that she was not alone. Hope crept back into her heart, fragile and trembling but alive. One evening, as the sky blazed with the fire of the setting sun, she found herself speaking more than she had in weeks. She told Elias about Thomas, the way he dreamed of building not just a ranch but a future, a place where their son could grow strong and free. Her words tumbled out with tears, her grief spilling into the golden light. Elias listened, his hands folded on his knees, his face cast in half-shadow. When she faltered, ashamed of her outpouring, he said only, "A man like that don't die easy. He lives in what you carry forward." His voice was low, steady, and it struck her like a brand against her heart. But she could see there was more to him than silence and scars. Sometimes, when he thought her gaze was elsewhere, his hand drifted to the mark on his jaw, fingers tracing it absently. Other times, when thunder rolled over the plains, his shoulders tightened, and his eyes grew distant, as if watching ghosts only he could see. She wanted to ask, but she sensed that to press him would break the fragile trust blooming between them. So she held her questions, offering him instead the small warmth of her gratitude, of her presence, of the child's gurgling laughter that softened even his stern face. The nights grew colder, the outlaws bolder. The sheriff did nothing, and townsfolk began surrendering land without a fight. Clara saw fear hollow out their faces, the same fear she had known. But she also saw something else in Elias, disgust, quiet and smoldering, as if each injustice struck an old wound. He did not speak of it, but she began to wonder if the solitude he wrapped around himself was less a choice and more a shield. A shield built after a war no one else in Ash Hollow cared to remember. Clara's child grew stronger under Elias's quiet guardianship, and so did she. Though her heart still bore grief, it also bore the faintest spark of hope, a spark Elias himself seemed unaware he had kindled. She did not know yet what blood had stained his past or what steel lived in his bones, but she knew this. The stranger in the shadows had given her and her son a chance to breathe again. And in a land where mercy was rare, that was enough to bind her fate to his, whether either of them admitted it aloud or not. The morning the outlaws came sniffing around Boone's land, the prairie was hushed as if it knew what kind of storm was about to break. Clara had been mending a torn blanket in the barn while her child slept, when the sound of horses clattering up the road jolted her. Dust billowed, and 6 men rode in, their laughter sharp and hollow. They swung down from their saddles with the arrogance of wolves sniffing out prey. Their leader, a wiry man with a snake's grin, spat into the dirt and shouted, "Boone, we heard you been shelterin' strays. Ain't smart, old man. Ain't smart at all." Elias stepped out from the barn shadows, steady as a tree, shoulders squared. He didn't reach for a gun, didn't bluster. He just stood there, quiet and unmoving, like stones set against a raging river. One outlaw smirked at his limp. Another sneered at the scars across his face. "Too old to fight, too stubborn to quit," the leader mocked. "We'll let you live if you stop playin' protector. Widow and babe got no place here." Their eyes crawled to Clara, who clutched her child close, fury and terror warring in her chest. Elias's voice, when it came, was low but iron-bound. "You'll not lay a hand on them." Laughter broke out, coarse and cruel. But in those quiet words, something in the air shifted. That night, the storm rolled in. The sky cracked with lightning, thunder shaking the very timbers of the barn. Rain slashed down, cold and relentless, seeping through gaps in the roof. Clara fought to soothe her child, but fever had taken hold, burning through his tiny body. His cries were thin and ragged, breaking her heart with each sound. She tried everything, cool rags, whispered prayers, but the sickness only deepened. Desperation clawed at her until her knees gave out. She thought she might lose him to the storm's fury. Then Elias was there, lifting the boy from her trembling arms with a gentleness she hadn't known a man could possess. He checked the child's breath, his pulse, his tiny lips paling against the fever. "We need warmth," he muttered, already moving, already knowing what to do. He built a fire strong enough to fight back the cold, brewed willow bark tea with sure hands, and cradled the child against his chest as if willing his own strength into him. Through the night, he stayed at the boy's side, eyes unblinking, whispering words Clara couldn't hear. When dawn broke, the fever had broken too. Her child slept, his breath even and steady. Clara, watching Elias's worn face in the pale light, saw not just a rancher but something greater. A leader, a protector, a man forged in fire who had chosen to stand for her. In the quiet of that morning, memories stirred in Elias like ghosts refusing to be silent. He remembered the smell of gunpowder, the screams of men cut down in wheat fields turned to graveyards. He remembered the weight of command, how boys looked to him with eyes full of trust as he led them into hell. He had sworn, when the war ended, never to take another life, never again to lead men into death. He buried that part of himself under years of silence, until the frontier's cruelty began to mirror the lawlessness of battlefields. Until Clara's eyes, fierce with both grief and defiance, forced him to reckon with the promise he had tried so hard to keep. The outlaws struck again days later, this time with fire. They came at dusk, torches burning bright against the darkening sky, and they hurled them onto the roof of the barn where Clara and her child had found refuge. Flames licked the dry wood, smoke billowing as Clara screamed, clutching her son. Elias pulled them both to safety, but the barn collapsed behind them in a roar of sparks. All she had left, her meager belongings, the scraps of life she'd managed to hold together, burned to ash in the dirt. The gang rode off laughing, their cruelty echoing in the night. Clara sank to her knees, the flames reflecting in her tear-filled eyes. Elias stood behind her, fists clenched, a tremor in his jaw. Something inside him cracked then, not like a breaking bone but like a blade drawn from its sheath. The town watched all of it, silent and still. They peered from windows, muttered in doorways, but not one stepped forward to help. Fear chained them. When Elias and Clara faced the gang in the street the next morning, no voice rose in protest. The outlaws swaggered, certain they had broken the old rancher's back. "Should have stayed quiet, Boone," their leader sneered. "Now you lose what's left." They thought age and a limp made him harmless. They were wrong. Elias's eyes swept the crowd, then the land beyond, the fences, the ridges, the choke points only a soldier would see. He had spent weeks preparing quietly, showing a handful of ranchers how to hold a rifle steady, how to move in pairs, how to use the land itself as cover. Men who had once been nothing more than cowhands now stood with rifles hidden beneath their coats, waiting for his signal. Farmers who'd been bent by fear straightened their spines, remembering the lessons whispered in Elias's barn. The old soldier's mind had never left him. It had only been sleeping, waiting for the day it was needed again. He spoke not to the outlaws but to the people cowering on porches. How long will you let them take what's yours? How long will you bow to men who rule with fear? His voice carried, rough but unshakable. Clara stood beside him, child in her arms, her face pale but resolute. When the gang jeered, demanding she be handed over, she stepped forward. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. I won't run. Not anymore. This land took my husband and you tried to take my son. You will not take another breath from me. Her words cracked the silence like lightning, and the town felt it. Suspense hung heavy in the air. The outlaws shifted, sensing something had changed but too arrogant to believe it mattered. They did not see the farmers moving into position, nor the glint of barrels in the shadows. They did not see the fire burning in the widow's eyes, or the way Elias's scarred face set like carved stone. What they saw was a broken rancher and a desperate woman. What they failed to see was a reckoning rising around them, one born not of rage alone but of justice long denied. And as the prairie wind swept through Ash Hollow, carrying the scent of gun oil and dust, the battle for the town's soul was about to begin. The gang rode in heavy, their pistols flashing in the sun, certain that the day would end with another body in the dust. But Elias Boone had not spent his years in silence for nothing. The land around his ranch had been studied, measured, and memorized. It was not merely soil to him but a map of advantage, every ridge and gully a line in his unspoken plan. He stood tall in the yard, Clara at his side, the child held tight in her arms, while the farmers and ranchers he had quietly trained waited for his signal. The air was still, brittle with the promise of violence. The first shots cracked like whips. Dust plumed from the fences as bullets struck, splinters flying. Elias raised his hand, and from the barns and haystacks his men answered, rifles steady, firing from cover. Horses screamed, outlaws cursing as their mounts buckled under fire. The gang had expected a weak stand, an old man's foolish defiance. Instead they found themselves swallowed by an ambush crafted with a soldier's cunning. Elias had placed his allies where the sun blinded the enemy, where the wind carried their sound away, where every movement was watched. The outlaws rallied, rushing toward the cabin, but Elias moved like a man decades younger. His limp was forgotten in the heat of battle, his eyes sharp, his commands clipped and certain. He sent 2 men circling wide, cutting off the gang's flank, while another pair drove cattle down the slope, spooking the horses and scattering the riders. The chaos split the enemy, and Elias struck with precision. Every shot he fired was deliberate, not wasted in fury but placed with deadly intent. Clara, watching from the cabin doorway, clutched her child but did not flinch. She had feared too long to tremble now. The fight raged until smoke filled the air, the scent of powder and sweat mingling with trampled grass. Men fell, groaning in the dust, and still the gang pressed on, desperate to seize what they had marked as theirs. But Elias would not bend. His voice rose above the chaos, steady as the roll of thunder, guiding the defenders with the calm of a man who had faced worse odds and survived. When their leader tried to charge the porch, Elias stepped forward himself, meeting him at close quarters. Their struggle was brutal, fists and blood and grit, until Elias slammed the man into the dirt, his pistol pressed cold against his jaw. "This ends here," he said, voice raw with finality. The outlaw's defiance broke, fear flooding his eyes. When the smoke cleared, the gang lay scattered, those still alive crawling back toward the horizon, their reign over Ash Hollow shattered. The townsfolk, who had hidden behind shutters and doors, now spilled into the street, their voices suddenly loud with praise and allegiance. "We were with you all along," they shouted. "We always hated that gang." Their cowardice sickened Clara, But Elias only looked at them with tired eyes. He had seen this before. Men who found their courage only after the danger had passed. He wasted no breath on them. The victory had cost him more than they would ever know. The sheriff arrived last, puffed up and red-faced, pretending outrage that such lawlessness had unfolded without his sanction. He muttered empty words about order and justice, but no one listened. Justice had been delivered already, not by his badge but by the scarred hands of a man who had once sworn never to fight again. Elias ignored him, turning instead to Clara, whose face was streaked with ash and tears, but whose eyes burned with the strength of someone who had finally refused to bow. Inside the cabin, after the crowd had dispersed, Elias sat at his worn table. His breaths were shallow, each one edged with pain he could no longer hide. Clara noticed the blood seeping from beneath his shirt, the way his hand trembled as he folded a piece of parchment. "You're hurt?" she whispered, fear knotting in her chest. He shook his head, forcing a faint smile. "Old wound," he said. "Been waiting to finish its work." Her heart dropped, but he slid the parchment across the table. His deed signed and sealed. "This land's yours now. Always meant it to be. Not for me. For someone who understands loss and still chooses to stand." Tears blurred her vision as she took the paper in her hands, the weight of it heavier than any weapon. "I can't take this from you," she whispered. He leaned back, his eyes dimming but steady. "It was never mine to keep. A ranch dies with a man who hides from life. But with you, with that boy, it can live." His words faltered, his strength waning, but there was peace in his gaze. He had carried the burden of command, the shame of survival, and at last he had laid it down where it could grow. Clara held his hand until the strength faded from it, until the scarred fingers relaxed and his chest stilled. The cabin was silent save for the soft breaths of her child. She stood then, the deed clutched in her fist, and stepped into the golden light of dusk. The ranch stretched before her, battered but unbroken, its fields waiting, its fences scarred but standing. Neighbors lingered at a distance, their faces filled with something new. Respect, perhaps even awe. Clara did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence, her child in her arms, the parchment against her breast. All of it told the story. And so the dirt where they had tried to bury her became the soil where her legacy grew. Justice on the frontier was never given. It was taken back by those with the courage to rise.